The morning arrived the same way it always did. Quiet, patient, and unhurried. Sunlight slipped through the thin lace curtains, resting gently on the wooden floor as if it didn't want to wake the house too loudly. I was already awake. At my age, sleep comes and goes like an old friend who no longer stays long. I sat by the window with my cup of tea, both hands wrapped around it, letting the warmth travel slowly into my fingers. These hands have done a lot in this lifetime. Held babies, wiped tears, worked long hours, and learned how to let go. Now they trembled just a little. Not from fear, just from time. Outside, the world was moving on without me. Children hurried past with backpacks too big for their shoulders. A woman laughed into her phone, her voice bright and careless. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. Life loud and alive. And then there was me, watching it all from behind glass. People think loneliness arrives suddenly, like a knock on the door. But it doesn't. Loneliness settles in slowly. It comes in the quiet mornings, when there's only one cup on the table, when no one asks how you slept, when the silence becomes so familiar, it starts to feel like company. I used to fill these mornings with noise. The radio stayed on. Sometimes the television too. Not because I was listening, but because I was afraid of what I might hear if everything went silent. Memories have a way of speaking up when you give them space. So I learned a routine. Wake up. Boil water. Eat first always. Sit by the window. Breathe. Pretend this was enough. On the small table beside me lay an old photo frame, turned face down. I hadn't meant to put it there. Just ended up that way. Funny how we do that with things that still hurt. We don't throw them away. We just turn them over, hoping time will soften their edges. I told myself I was fine. I had told myself that for years. I had survived worse after all. Disappointment. Long nights when hope felt like a language I no longer understood. Still, something about this morning felt heavier, like the air itself was waiting for me to remember something I'd worked very hard to forget. I glanced at the clock. Too early to go anywhere. Too late to fall back asleep. That in-between hour where thoughts grow louder and regrets feel closer. People see me now and think my story is finished. An old woman, quiet life, nothing left to say. But stories don't end when the noise stops. Sometimes that's when they finally begin to speak. I took another sip of tea and finally reached for the photo frame. My fingers hesitated before turning it over. Not yet, I told myself. Some mornings the past can wait. But deep down, I knew this piece I had built was fragile. And like every quiet morning before a storm, it was only calm because something was about to change. I didn't know it yet, but this was the morning my silence would start to break. I didn't plan on thinking about the past that morning. Just found me. That's how it always works. You can build walls, keep busy, learn the art of distraction, but all it takes is one small thing to bring everything rushing back. The kettle clicked off with a sharp sound, pulling me from my thoughts. I stood slowly, my knees reminding me of every year I had lived, and carried the cup back to the table. That's when I noticed the envelope. It wasn't new. It hadn't arrived that day. I had placed it there the evening before and told myself I would deal with it later. Plain. No return address. Just my name written carefully across the front, in handwriting I hadn't seen in decades. For a long moment I simply stared at it. Some names don't fade with time. They stay sharp, tucked away in the corners of your heart, waiting. I hadn't said his name out loud in years. Not to anyone. Not even to myself. But seeing that handwriting was like hearing it whispered again. Soft, familiar, and painful all at once. I sat down slowly, the envelope still untouched. My heart wasn't racing. It wasn't panic I felt. It was something heavier. The kind of ache that settles deep in your chest and refuses to move. I remembered the first time I heard his name. How it sounded back then. Full of promise, full of future. We were young. Too young to understand how easily life can turn. Too young to know that love alone doesn't always protect you from the choices you don't know how to make. I had carried that name with me through the years, even when I pretended I hadn't. In crowded rooms where laughter filled the air, It would drift into my thoughts uninvited. In quiet nights, when sleep refused to come, it would sit beside me like an old ghost. People would ask about my past, about the life I had lived before I became the old woman on the corner. I learned how to smile politely, how to change the subject. Some truths are easier to bury than explain. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what the past had to say to me after all this time. Instead, my mind wandered back, to a day when that name was still spoken with laughter, to a time when I believed silence could protect me. I had been wrong about that. Silence doesn't protect anything, just teaches pain how to wait. The house felt different now. Smaller. Like the walls themselves were listening. I could almost hear my younger self moving through these rooms, full of plans, unaware of how one decision could echo for a lifetime. I finally stood and walked to the window again, clutching the envelope to my chest. Outside, the same children passed by. The same woman laughed into her phone. Life still moving forward. And there I was, standing still, holding a name that refused to stay buried. I whispered it under my breath. Just once. It hurt more than I expected. Some names don't belong to the past. They belong to the unfinished parts of us. And as I stood there that morning, I realized something I had avoided for years. This story wasn't over. Not yet. There are days that divide your life in two. One moment you're walking forward unaware. The next, you're standing still, watching everything you knew slip quietly out of reach. I didn't know it at the time, of course. None of us ever do. I remember that day clearly. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it felt ordinary. The kind of ordinary that fools you into thinking tomorrow will look the same. The sky was pale, stretched thin with clouds that refused to decide whether they wanted to rain. I had on my favorite dress, the blue one that made me feel a little braver than I really was. I remember smoothing it down, telling myself to breathe, telling myself I could still turn back. But I didn't. I had rehearsed my words all morning, standing in front of the mirror, whispering them softly so no one would hear. I told myself I would be honest, that I would finally say what needed to be said. Yet with every step I took, my courage grew quieter. He was waiting for me just where he said he'd be. When I saw him, he smiled, the same smile that once made me believe everything would work out. For a brief moment, I almost forgot why I was there. We talked about small things at first. The weather, work, plans that now feel like stories from another lifetime. My heart pounded, each second urging me to speak, to interrupt, to change the course of what was coming. But fear has a powerful voice. Tells you to wait, to be careful, to think of the consequences. And I listened. When the moment came, I hesitated. The truth sat heavy on my tongue, demanding to be freed. All it needed was one breath, one brave sentence. Instead, I smiled. He nodded, chose silence. I told myself there would be another chance. There always is, we think. Tomorrow. Next week. When things calm down. When the timing is right. But timing is a fragile thing. Something shifted in his eyes. A decision made without my knowing. He spoke about leaving, about an opportunity he couldn't pass up. My chest tightened, but still I said nothing. I watched my future walk quietly toward the edge, and I didn't stop it. When we parted that day, he hugged me longer than usual. I felt it then, a small ache, a warning. I wanted to pull him back, to finally speak. But my arms fell to my sides. And just like that, it was over. The days that followed moved too fast and too slow at the same time. Letters went unanswered. Calls stopped coming. And slowly, painfully, I understood what my silence had cost me. I replayed that moment for years. The way the light fell across his face. The sound of my own heartbeat drowning out my courage. If I had spoken just once, everything might have been different. That day didn't end with shouting or tears. It ended with a goodbye that felt unfinished. And sometimes the quietest goodbyes leave the deepest scars. Silence doesn't ask for payment right away. It lets you believe you got away with it. That nothing truly changed. But slowly, patiently, it begins to collect what it's owed. First, I told myself I was fine. People always do. I went to work, smiled when spoken to, and answered questions with practiced ease. On the outside, my life looked untouched. On the inside, something had shifted, like a picture hanging just slightly crooked on the wall of my heart. The days felt longer, nights even more so. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that last moment over and over. Not the goodbye, but the second before it. The breath I didn't take. The words I didn't say. They followed me everywhere, whispering reminders of what I had chosen not to fight for. Friends noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. "You seem quieter," one of them said gently. I smiled and nodded. Quiet felt safer. Quiet didn't ask questions. But silence has a way of isolating you. Invitations slowed. Conversations became shallow. It's hard to let people close when you're afraid of what might slip out if they do. I learned how to keep my pain neat and hidden, folded carefully behind polite laughter. Then came the judgments, the ones never spoken out loud. People assumed they knew my story. A woman my age, alone, no husband by her side. Society is quick to fill in the blanks when you refuse to speak. I carried their assumptions like an invisible weight, heavy but familiar. Work became my refuge. I stayed late, took extra shifts, filled my time with responsibility. If my hands were busy, my heart didn't have to be. Or so I thought. But pain doesn't disappear when ignored. It just learns new places to live. Some days, it showed up as exhaustion so deep it felt physical. Other days it was anger, sharp and unexpected, aimed at the smallest things. And sometimes it arrived as shame. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I hadn't done something right. I wondered often how different my life might have been if I had spoken that day. If love had been enough. If courage had arrived on time. Those questions had no answers, only echoes. Years passed, and I grew older, carrying a secret no one could see. I built a life that looked complete from the outside. Home. Routine. A reputation for being strong. But strength, I learned, is sometimes just another word for surviving quietly. Every so often I would hear his name in passing, a stranger with the same sound, a character in a story, and my chest would tighten without warning. That was the price of my silence. A wound that never fully healed. Still, I told myself it was too late. That the past was best left untouched. That some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. I believed that for a long time. But deep down I knew the truth. Silence hadn't protected me. It had shaped my entire life. After a while, pain stops screaming. Settles. Becomes a quiet companion that walks beside you through the years. You learn its weight. You learn how to move with it. And eventually you stop calling it pain at all. You call it life. That's how the years passed for me. Not in milestones, but in routines. I woke up early. I went to work. Paid my bills on time. I smiled at neighbors and nodded politely to strangers. From the outside I was doing just fine. People admired my independence, my strength. They said I was resilient. I let them believe that. What they didn't see were the small things. The empty chair at the table that I never moved. The way I still cooked portions meant for two before reminding myself to put half away. The way I avoided certain songs because they carried memories I wasn't ready to unpack. Survival teaches you discipline. Teaches you how to keep going even when your heart feels tired. I became very good at it. Years turned into decades. Faces changed. Streets were renamed. People came and went from my life like seasons. I attended weddings with polite applause and funerals with quiet tears. Each event reminded me that time does not pause for grief. It moves forward whether you are ready or not. Sometimes late at night I allowed myself to remember. Not the heartbreak but the hope. The version of me who once believed life could turn out differently. I wondered what became of that girl. Where she had gone. When exactly I stopped listening to her. I never married. Not because I didn't want to, but because my heart had learned to be cautious. Love felt like a risk I could no longer afford. So I chose safety. Predictability. Solitude dressed up as peace. And for a while it worked. I built a small life that fit neatly around my wounds. Kept busy. I stayed useful. I told myself that meaning came from responsibility, not from connection. It was easier that way. But surviving isn't the same as living. There were moments, brief and unexpected, when I felt it. A sharp ache while watching a couple argue lovingly in a grocery store. A sudden sadness when I saw a child reach for a parent's hand. Those moments passed quickly, but they left their mark. As I grew older, people stopped asking questions. Age gave me permission to be quiet, to be alone. The world expects less from you then, and somehow that hurts more than being expected to explain yourself. I learned how to be content with little. A warm cup of tea, clean house, familiar routine. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a part of me still waited. Not for a person, but for resolution. Survival had kept me alive. But it had also kept me unfinished. And as the years continued to pass, I began to wonder, very quietly, whether life had more to offer me than simply enduring it. The knock on the door came just after noon. Soft, uncertain, like it wasn't sure it belonged there. I hadn't been expecting anyone. These days I rarely was. For a moment I stayed where I was, listening. In a quiet house, even the smallest sound feels louder than it should. The knock came again, followed by the faint shuffle of footsteps. Someone was waiting. I stood slowly, my heart beating just a little faster than usual. Not from fear, but from instinct. Some part of me already knew this wasn't an ordinary visit. When I opened the door, no one stood there. Just a small parcel resting on the doorstep. Brown paper, tied with thin string. My name written neatly across the top. I stared at it for a long time before bending down to pick it up. It felt heavier than it looked. Not in weight, but in meaning. Inside, I found a bundle of old letters, yellowed with age. Their edges soft from being handled too many times. My breath caught. I recognized the handwriting instantly. I didn't need to read a single word to know who they were from. At the bottom of the box was a photograph. It was of him. Older, thinner, but unmistakably the same man I had once known. He was standing beside a young woman and a little boy. Family. A life he had lived, without me. My hands trembled as I lowered myself into the chair. The room felt smaller again, the air heavier. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. Felt something quieter. Acceptance mixed with a sadness so deep it felt like relief. Tucked behind the photograph was a note. Just one page. I don't know if this will reach you, it read. But I've carried you with me longer than you might believe. Closed my eyes. He wrote about the years that passed. About choices made in uncertainty. About the silence between us that never truly left. He didn't accuse me. He didn't explain everything. He simply told the truth as he remembered it. And then came the part that undid me. I never stopped wondering what you wanted to say that day. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my chest. For so long, I had believed my silence had erased me from his life. That my absence had been complete. But here it was. Proof that even unspoken words leave echoes. The note ended with an address. A place not too far from where I lived now. He didn't ask me to come. He didn't demand anything. He just wrote, "If you ever decide you're ready, I'll be there." I sat there for hours, the box open on my lap, the past spread out before me. This reminder hadn't come to reopen wounds. It had come to ask a question I could no longer avoid. After all these years, was I finally ready to answer? That night, sleep refused to come. The house was dark, but my mind was wide awake, lit up by memories I had kept carefully hidden for years. The letters sat on the table beside my bed, silent but heavy, like they were watching me. I had spent my life protecting one truth by burying it. I told myself I did it out of strength, out of responsibility. But lying awake in the quiet, I finally admitted what it really was. Fear. Back then, I had been terrified of what honesty might cost me. Of being judged. Of being abandoned. Of becoming someone people whispered about instead of welcomed. So I chose silence. I chose the version of myself the world found easier to accept. The truth I never spoke wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was simple, and that's what made it powerful. I had loved him more deeply than I knew how to explain. But I was also carrying something else. A responsibility I didn't know how to share. A future that had already begun to change without my permission. I had been pregnant. Saying it now feels strange, like speaking a language I forgot long ago. Back then, those words felt impossible. The world wasn't kind to women who didn't follow its rules. And I was young, alone, and afraid of being cast aside by everyone I knew. I told myself I would find the right moment. That once things felt safer, I would tell him. But life doesn't wait for courage to arrive. It moves forward with or without your honesty. When he spoke about leaving that day, I panicked. I thought silence might keep everything in place. I thought if I said nothing, I could figure things out on my own. I was wrong. The pregnancy didn't last long. Loss came quietly, without ceremony or comfort. There was no one to hold my hand. No one to share the grief with. Just me learning how to mourn something I never allowed myself to hope for. After that, I convinced myself I had done the right thing. That telling him would have only brought pain. That some truths were too heavy to carry together. But years have a way of teaching you differently. As I lay there in the dark, I realized the truth hadn't protected anyone. Not him. Not me. It had only grown heavier with time, shaping every choice I made afterward. The letters on the table weren't asking for explanations. They weren't demanding forgiveness. They were simply a mirror, showing me the life I had lived around an unspoken truth. I sat up and reached for one of the letters, my fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what might have happened if I had been brave enough to speak. Not to rewrite the past, but to finally understand it. That night, I whispered the truth out loud. Just to myself. And for the first time in decades, it felt like a burden I didn't have to carry alone. The address sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I touched it again. I walked past it dozens of times, pretending it wasn't there, pretending I hadn't already memorized every number. Fear has a way of disguising itself as patience. I told myself I was being careful. In truth, I was stalling. On the 4th morning, I woke up with a calm I didn't recognize. It wasn't courage. Not exactly. It was something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. Or exhaustion from running away from a moment that had waited half a lifetime for me. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes that felt familiar rather than special. I didn't want armor. I wanted honesty. Before leaving, I paused by the mirror and looked at the woman staring back at me. Older, softer, carrying more history than she ever planned to. And yet, there was something steadier in her eyes. The journey felt longer than it was. Every street stirred a memory. Every red light gave me another chance to turn back. I didn't. When I reached the address, my hands shook as I stepped out of the car. The house was modest, quiet. Nothing about it demanded attention. And somehow that made everything harder. I stood at the door for a long moment, listening to my own breath. This was it. No rehearsed words. No second chances. Just truth, arriving late but sincere. When the door opened, time seemed to fold in on itself. He stood there, older, yes, but instantly recognizable. His hair had thinned, his posture softened, but his eyes were the same. They widened when he saw me, not in shock, but in recognition. As if some part of him had always expected this moment. Neither of us spoke at first. Then he smiled. Not the bright, hopeful smile from our youth, but a gentler one. The kind that understands loss. I wondered if you'd come, he said quietly. Inside, the house smelled like old books and morning light. We sat across from each other, hands resting on our knees, like strangers learning how to speak again. Words came slowly at first, safe ones. Health. Life. And then the silence returned. Not the fearful silence of the past, but one filled with meaning. I should have said something, I finally whispered. He nodded. I know. I told him everything. Not with excuses. Not with apologies meant to erase the past. Just the truth as it was. My voice trembled, but it didn't stop. I spoke of fear, of loss, of the life shaped by one unspoken moment. He listened without interruption. When I finished, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "I waited for you to speak," he said. "But I also lived." Those words didn't hurt the way I expected. They felt honest, necessary. Facing the past didn't undo it. But sitting there, finally seen, finally heard, I realized something important. The past loses its power when you stop running from it. I thought forgiveness would arrive like a moment, sudden and complete. A few words spoken, a few tears shed, and everything neatly placed back where it belonged. But I learned that day that real forgiveness is quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly like understanding. When I stood to leave, there was no dramatic goodbye. No promises made about the future. Just a shared pause at the door, heavy with all the years we could never return to. He reached out gently and held my hand. Not to keep me, but to acknowledge what had been. "I'm glad you came," he said. So was I. The drive home felt different. The road hadn't changed, but I had. The weight I'd carried for decades felt lighter. Not gone but loosened. I wasn't forgiven in the way I once imagined. And neither was he. What we found instead was something more honest. We forgave each other for being human. For being young and afraid. For choosing safety over truth. For believing silence could protect us from pain. It couldn't, but we didn't know that then. That night, I sat alone in my living room. The same quiet that once felt so heavy now feeling manageable. The letters rested on the table. No longer accusing, no longer urgent. Just part of a story that had finally been told. I realized forgiveness wasn't about erasing regret. It was about making room for compassion. For the person you were when you didn't know better. For the first time I allowed myself to grieve properly. Not just the love I lost, but the woman I had been before fear reshaped her. I cried softly without shame, letting the tears come and go like old friends. As the night deepened, a strange peace settled over me. Not happiness, not closure, something gentler. I didn't need him to make things right. I didn't need the past to change. What I needed was to stop punishing myself for surviving the only way I knew how. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always come from the person you wronged. Sometimes it comes from within, when you finally decide to stop holding your own mistakes against yourself. And in that quiet room with no one watching, I felt it. Not a grand release, just a soft letting go. And that, it turned out, was enough. Morning light filtered gently through the lace curtains, the same way it always had, yet everything felt different. I sat by the window with my cup of tea, but this time I didn't feel the heavy weight of years pressing down on me. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, one that had taken decades to reach. I thought about the journey that brought me here, the silence I once chose, the words I never spoke, the pain I carried alone. I thought about him, the letters, and the meeting that finally changed the way I viewed my past. And most of all, I thought about myself, the woman who survived, who endured, who finally learned that life doesn't demand perfection. It demands honesty with oneself. Some stories never reach a tidy ending, and perhaps that is their beauty. Life is not about erasing mistakes or rewriting the past. It is about acknowledging them, learning from them, and using those lessons to shape the rest of your days. I learned that silence can be heavier than words, that fear can keep you small, and that courage often arrives quietly, after years of waiting. I understood that forgiveness, both given and received, is not an event but a process. It is gentle, patient, and sometimes incomplete, but it has the power to release you from the chains of regret. I learned to forgive him, yes, but more importantly, I learned to forgive myself. That lesson alone changed everything. Looking back, I realized that every choice I made, even the ones I regretted, brought me here, to a place of reflection, acceptance, and peace. The moments I thought were lost were, in fact, teachers. Each loss, each silence, each heartbreak became a chapter in a story that is mine and mine alone to tell. And so I leave this truth for anyone who listens. life will challenge you in ways you never imagined. It will ask you to speak when fear whispers to stay quiet, to act when doubt tells you to wait. And though you may falter, though you may stumble, you will survive, and you will learn. You will learn that the weight of unspoken words can shape a lifetime, but the courage to face them can reshape it too. I take one last sip of my tea and let the warmth spread through me. Outside, the world moves forward as it always has, as it always will. And I am here, fully present, with a heart softened by time, tempered by experience, and guided by the lessons of a life lived honestly, even when it began with silence. This is the story I leave behind. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for those who need to hear it. Your words matter, your voice matters, and your choices, even the quiet ones, define the life you will one day reflect upon. I smile softly to myself. The quiet mornings are no longer lonely. They are mine. And that, I realize, is enough.